Let us start with the good news. The war in Syria is coming to its end. After almost 8 years of bloody war, I guess we can speak about the final stages of this war with a clear victorious, the ruling regime and the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad. The bad news have to do with, of course, the cost of this war. Those who lost, first of all, lost their life. We are speaking about tragedy. We are speaking about not only the biggest tragedy we witness in our immediate region, but total failure of the international community to meet the challenge it faced when it came to Syria. We speak about 500,000 people that were killed during those 8 years, and about 1/3 of the population which was forced to leave not only the immediate home, but the country, and to find shelter and refuge in a neighboring country, but also in Europe. So let me say a few words about the causes, the deep causes of this war. And as I said before, we have something in common, because when we see such a tragedy, and when we speak about violence in the Middle East, we have to speak in terms of infection, disease, virus that is spreading all over the region and the world. We have to look at the deeper causes. And let me start with the environment. I mean, we can, look at what happened in Syria in different ways. There are those who say, what happened in Syria. Of course, each country has its uniqueness, but we are speaking about a global phenomenon. I mean, because we witness this process of globalization, and there were those who advocate and promote this idea of globalization. And in many of the places in the world, the average or the simple man, mainly in the rural areas and the periphery, felt that he was being ignored by the elite in the capital, by the rulers, that globalization worked not in favor of him, but against his own interests. And the result, the reaction, well, there is a place like the United States where the previous elections, let's wait for the election in November, but 2016, we saw a say. We saw what the average simple man in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin or Florida, upper state New York, had to say about this process and about Washington. We saw what happened in Britain when, people in Wales, in other places, had to say about the European Union, while in London, people vote for keeping the commitment to the European Union. We saw it in Eastern Europe. We saw it even in a place like Turkey, where in Ankara, the capital, in Istanbul, people voted against the president, against Erdogan, while in the rural areas, people saw him as some sort of an outsider. So it's a global phenomenon. We witness it also in the Middle East. But when we speak about the Middle East, and Syria is not an exception, because we focus on Syria. It's our immediate neighbor, but let us remember that we witness a terrible civil war in Yemen with catastrophic results. And let us think about Libya, a collapsing a state which collapsed. So it's a regional phenomenon that had to do with two important things we have to take into consideration. I mean, on the one hand, the changes in the region, the growth of population. Nobody can understand the problems of the Middle East without looking at this factor. Think about it. 50 years ago, 1960, the size of the European population was around 400 million. 50 years later, 2000, 2010, 500 million. So there was an increase of 25%. Most of them, or at least half of this increase, had to do with immigrants from outside Europe. When we look at 2050, the same 500 million. We don't expect any growth in the population of Europe. When you look at the Middle East, 1960, 100 million people lived in the Middle East. 50 years later, when in Europe they jump from 400 to 500, increase of 25%, in the Middle East the jump was from 100 million to 400 million. And when we look at 2050, 750 million people will live in this region. Now, I forgot to thank you for bringing us the sun, but here in Israel, because it's an advanced country, it's not an issue. But all over the region, the global warming is an important factor. And in the case of Syria, they witnessed severe drought for the last 10 years that you can't find any precedent in the records since they start recording and monitoring weather and climate changes in our region about 100 years ago. Countries that are dependent on agriculture, and when agriculture is dependent on rain, well, the result is the collapse of the economy, the collapse of the agriculture sector, and as a result, the collapse of the state and the society. Two important things. And the other thing, if you look back, let's say 30, 40, 50 years ago, South America, most of the rulers had to do with colonels from the army. India was even in China or Eastern Europe, still under the Soviet rule. There was tremendous change all over the world. The only place where we didn't witness any change when it comes to the question of democracy, openness, changes within the society was the Middle East. So when I'm speaking about the environment, when I'm speaking about the deep causes for the crisis the entire region is witness, well, we have to take into consideration those reasons. But when we come to speak about Syria, once again, what we have in common, I and you, protest, peaceful protest of peasants in the rural areas that started, as I said before, as some sort of a protest, but then the question, what should be the treatment? Will you engage in a dialogue, or will you send your army, your security forces, tanks, and start shooting at the demonstrator? And that's actually what happened in Syria. It is in the DNA of the regime to react and to treat such protests by using force. And what we witnessed was the deterioration from peaceful protest to a popular uprising, then to a revolution, and then eventually to ethnic, bloody war, and also a war of jihad. And what is interesting is that we didn't witness all of these phenomena when the war started, when the protest started, which had to do with peaceful protest, demonstration, with demands for more rights and for freedom, and had nothing to do with radical Islam. So we have to think about the right treatment. Clearly, there was no right treatment there. We have to think, and one of my conclusions is that it's not that bad people create bad conditions and bad circumstances and tragedy create bad people, because I study Syria all of my life, and nothing that I study prepare me for what I saw. When people in the same neighborhood who used to live side by side in a coexistence for years start butchering and killing each other. And then there is the foreign intervention. I guess that unless there was foreign intervention from regional actors who turned this country into a battlefield in order to promote regional and international interests, we could have reached the final stages of this war some years ago. But when you have here a competition between Iran, rising powers, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, also Israel, who decided to turn Syria into a battlefield, and by intervening in this war, fuel this war, and of course Russia, and to a certain extent the United States, well, the result was clear. And still, this is a case where the bad guy, now bad guy, it's relative terminology, because ISIS was no better than Bashar al-Assad. Still, my argument is that, first of all, he's still the legitimate president, and the whole arguments he is making have to do with, him being the legitimate ruler in the eyes of the international law and the international community. Then he had the army, the security forces, the arsenal of impressive advanced weapons on his side. He had the countries who were ready to support him, Iran, but mainly Russia. And the other argument I would like to make, it's not by mistake. I mean, ISIS was terrible, but most of the people who were killed in Syria and who were deported from Syria were killed in the hands of the regime and its allies, Russia and Iran. So we are speaking here about a policy, a planned policy of ethnic cleansing, of carrying out a total war. The message was very clear. I mean, it's Bashar message, but also it's the Russian message. Wherever you have, enemies, terrorists, warriors, in order to get rid of them, deal with the environment. And Bashar said it very clear. My problem is not with those who fight against me, but with their parents, their families, their relatives who support them. There will be no relatives, there will be no revolt, and that's actually what happened. And as in many other cases in the past, the war is coming to an end with his victory, because people, the international community had no answer, and Syria was not more important. As one of my colleagues in Washington explained me, the number of casualties, it's an average number in each of the civil wars we witness in Africa and other places. It's the same average number, and the average number of refugees, it's the same like in Africa and other places. And Syria is not as important and has no real resources, so why to bother about Syria? And when we look to the future, I mean, we can learn something from our past history. I mean, I have in mind the civil war in Spain, a terrible civil war, a dictator that won the war with the help of the authoritarian regime of that time, Germany and Italy. But the world was the victorious, and eventually he became a good guy and our friend. Well, this was the Cold War, and it's my sense that this is something that can happen, because the world tend to forget. Bashar al-Assad is the one who won the war, and if we want to push back Iran and stabilize the region. And, well, let us remember, as President Putin reminds us from time to time, is secular, is not radical, is our best chance to fight radicalism. The war will come to an end, but I'm afraid it will not be a happy end, clearly not for those who lost their life or their relatives, and clearly not for the immigrants, because for those of you who came from Europe, when I mentioned the figures, you know, in 2050, 750 million people will live in the region with no water resources, with no energy resources, under backwarded regimes. Well, what are they going to do? What will they do? Probably they will try to get into Europe. So have it in mind. But let me come to my final conclusion. The war is coming to an end, and I think still what we can learn from this terrible experience is how to avoid the next tragedy. I think that what we all do in universities and research centers is how to not only advance our research, but how to make our world better. So let us hope that you will do much better than we Orientalists or people who dealt with the Middle East, who couldn't expect this tragedy when it arrived and failed in many of the cases to analyze it, and now have to face its terrible result. Thank you very much, and once again, have a wonderful